Chrysler styling has typically vacillated between extreme levels of success and also extreme levels of, well, let's just call it lack of success. Starting with the 1957 model year, in which Chrysler introduced its new forward-look cars that were such a smash hit that they catapulted Plymouth to over 700,000 unit sales in 1957 and enabled it to snatch the number 3 sales crown. However, the 1957 vehicles, while they certainly were great looking, were not well built and tended to be rust prone and have a number of quality issues. And so in subsequent years, the styling wasn't enough to necessarily tempt buyers to purchase these vehicles. And as the years would go by and the 1950s would turn into the 1960s, the styling on some of these Mopars under the last years of Virgil Exner, let's just say, got extremely unconventional. And Exner was eventually let go in 1962 after his new lineup for the Chrysler Corporation just didn't resonate with buyers at all, in part because of the size, and that was a decision that he was forced into by Chrysler management. But nonetheless, some of these vehicles, let's just say, are interesting looking. But with Virgil Exner's departure came Elwood Engel from Ford, and Engel had made a name for himself as leading the design of the 1961 Continental. And Chrysler hired him to really put in place more conventional styling and get away from the Exner-era fins and craziness. And frankly, Engel did just that. Starting with the 1964 Imperial and continuing on throughout the lineup in subsequent years, Chrysler really kind of revamped their entire styling direction into a more conventional, let's say, direction, but also a very handsome one as well. But at least in my opinion, it was the 1969 era Fuselage full-size vehicles, the C-body vehicles that Chrysler introduced, that really marked the pinnacle of Elwood Engel styling at Chrysler. I don't think that there's a bad-looking Fuselage era car, aside from maybe some of the 1973 models, where Chrysler was forced to redo some of the front ends because the Fuselage era bumpers just couldn't quite take the 5-mile-an-hour crash standards. But overall, the 1969 to 1973 C-bodies are some of the best-looking Chryslers that were ever produced. And I've tried to compile an appropriate top 5 best-looking Fuselage list, but it's really hard because, like I said, I think all the Fuselage-era cars and the full-size vehicles from Chrysler during this period are good-looking. There are just some that I would say are better than others. So let's start out with the top 5 list and begin at number 5. And that is the 1970 Plymouth Sport Fury. Now, some may say, why are you picking the 1970 Plymouth Sport Fury and not, let's say, the 1969 or the Fury 1, 2, 3, etc.? Well, let's start out with the top of the line and most performance-oriented version, so thus the Sport Fury. But why not the 1969? Well, here's the 1969 Plymouth Fury, as you can see here. And I like a number of elements about this. It's a handsome car, no doubt. But the front end just isn't quite what the 1970 Plymouth front end is. I do like on the 69 the exposed headlights and the grille that kind of tapers towards the headlights. But overall, let's now see a picture of the 1970s Plymouth Sport Fury with the hidden headlights. And wow, that is just the front end look that is awesome. Changing those headlights from being exposed to hidden, and by the way, they weren't hidden on all of the Furies in 1970, although you could get optional hidden headlights. It just makes the entire car look wider because now, as opposed to the headlights kind of breaking up the grille just continues from the middle of the hood area all the way out through the headlights. And you can see here that it's just an overall beautiful front end theme. One might say it looks a little back-endy, if you will. You could almost exchange the hidden headlamp doors for taillights, and that could be the rear end of a car and would be a pretty attractive one at that. But I think the 1970 Plymouth Sport Fury is just a handsome car overall. I love the hood in particular with those 2 bulges on it that really give it some great definition and character. And those were there in 1969, but as I said, this 1970 front end just does it for me. Now, if I had to nitpick at one area of the 70 Sport Fury's styling, I would say that the rear end and that rear three-quarter view that you can see in this photo is pretty conventional. You've got the 2 tail lamps on either side and a middle panel that reads Plymouth. But aside from that, it's kind of conventional. It looks good. It's handsome. but I wish it had a little bit more pizzazz back there than what it does. Oh well, of course, the other great thing about the 1970 Furies is that you could get the Paisley mod tops if you so wanted or were so inclined. And there were a whole suite of engine choices under hood, everything from a standard 225 cubic inch slant 6 in select models. And then if you got models like the 4-door hardtop and some of the upper end models, you got a standard 318. But you could option up to one of any number of 383s or even 440s, including the 440 6-pack in your 1970 Sport Fury. So you could get these as really screaming cars from the factory. You could not get the 426 Hemi underhood, unfortunately, or the 340. Those were reserved for the CUDA. But still could get some awesome engines in your 70 Sport Fury, and it was a great looking ride.
Let's move on to number 4. And at number 4, we have the 1972 Dodge Monaco.
Now, I have to admit that this was one of my selections that I debated, should this go further up the list? Because I absolutely love the 1972 Dodge Monaco. Everything about it, the front, the rear, even the interior, the seat pattern, I really like. Although, unfortunately, one of the downsides of these Fuselage-era cars is they really didn't have great interior materials, and they kind of were tinny sounding and relatively noisy on the inside. But let's forget about the downside of these vehicles, because the styling is, in general, just so excellent. The exterior styling, that is. And the 72 Monaco, like I said, is just one of my absolute favorites. Now, in 1972, the Monaco would get hidden headlamps. And this, to me, just changed the entire look of the front end of the vehicle. And it had the hidden headlamps up front. And I don't even know how to describe the overall front end look. It's just so gosh darn cool. You can see here you have the hidden headlights, and then you have like an air gap almost underneath the headlamp doors before the bumper starts. And then the bumper has air inlets in it as well. And I suspect that area above the bumper is also a place where air can enter under hood. But it's just a super cool front end look. This is on a Dodge Royal Monaco wagon. So, wow, an awesome wagon. Imagine you were driving this around. And the 72 and the 73, I would say, are equally handsome. The only thing about the 73 is they got some especially chunky bumper guards that you can see in this photo, but it still looks, I think, great. And the back end on these vehicles also is quite stellar. Let's take a look at that here. And notice here on the 1972 Monaco, I love this rear full-width style taillight with the reverse lights integrated in and the big kind of taillight turn signals on either side. That coupled with the extended, let's call them, rear quarter panels that form a little bit of a W shape if you count that ridge or that wind split, I guess, in the center of the deck lid. It's just a overall handsome shape. You can also see how the light is breaking here on the surfaces and just gives it a beautiful look. I do find that the bumper guards here are humorously dainty and clearly would not meet the 5-mile-an-hour impact standard, which would be introduced in 1974 in the rear, but at least the overall vehicle looks good. And unfortunately, aside from the bumper guards, one of the things that I don't care for the 1973 Monaco is that while it has a similarly styled front end, they did change the entire appearance of the rear, and I don't think that the tail lamp treatment or the bumper is nearly as attractive as the 1972 version that you just saw. I will give an honorable mention on Monaco rear ends to the 1970 Monaco rear end, where I admittedly love the reverse lights and kind of this shark gill-like reverse lights. I think it's an overall very handsome treatment, but the 1972 Monaco remains my favorite. Let's move on to number 3, and that is the 1972 Imperial.
Now, when the Fuselage-era Imperial was introduced for the 1969 model year, it was a supremely handsome car, as you can see here, and very stately. I especially love the cornering lights, the kind of shark gill cornering lights, and you have a full-width grille inclusive of hidden headlights with a full loop bumper, which was pretty typical for the time. But as time went on, I think the Imperial actually got better and better with age, and by 1972, the styling to me had really hit its pinnacle. The front as well as the rear ends of the 1972 Imperial were redone, and I think just done in a wonderfully tasteful manner. Some people say that the front end looks like the rear end of a car, and I think even GM's Bill Mitchell, the then styling VP, actually had one of these going around the tech center backwards to try to make a point that he wanted distinctive front ends. But I think it's cool, and the parking lights, the supersized parking lights, are inspired by some 1920s car that starts with a W that is escaping my mind. So put a comment in the comments section if you can recall what that is. But I do love the hidden headlights, the egg crate grille. The 72 grille, I think, was the best of this design. In 73, obviously those huge chunky bumper guards would be put on the Imperial in the front, and the grille texture would change. But the 72 is just about perfection in every aspect. And candidly, the rear end is too. I love these vertical style taillights that are similar to Cadillac, but different. They actually have kind of this scalloped out area of the taillight that gives it some dimension. And I love the side marker light in the rear, as well as the mid-century modern block Imperial lettering. It just looks so cool. Now, at this point, the Imperial was getting to be kind of a dressed-up Chrysler, but it did have a lot of its own unique components. The roofline was one of those elements that was shared. And to give it a different backlight, Imperial had this Frenched-in kind of rear window where there was a cap placed over the Chrysler rear window to make the Imperial's rear window smaller, as you can see here. Some of those unique components included the front suspension, which was Imperial specific. So despite the fact that the Imperial, ever since I would say the 1967 model year, when the Imperial transitioned to unibody, it kind of became an increasingly gussied up Chrysler. Still had some unique components. I also love in this case, you can see the rear bumper, and the reverse light is in between those two tiny little bumper guards. But the rear bumper has this thick section at the outer ends, and then it kind of tailors to a narrower section in the middle, making the rear end look less huge than what it already is. But as you can see from this rear three-quarter photo, the car is just a stunningly huge car. In fact, the 1973 Imperial, because of its bumper guards, would end up being the longest production non-limousine vehicle ever produced by an American automaker, and it's also a unibody car. This is not a body-on-frame vehicle. It's a unibody, and it's a very, very strong, rigid unibody at that. So much so that, unfortunately, these cars were loved in demo derbies, along with the 1966, actually, I would say all of the mid and early 60s Imperials were also beloved demo derby cars, kind of similar to those suicide door Lincolns of the mid-60s. And unfortunately, that's one reason why not many of them survived. They didn't make many, and anytime somebody could find one of these for a demo derby, they tended to buy it up if it were in ratty condition. Now, I must say that one other area where this Imperial excels is in its interior, which most of the interiors in the Fuselage era cars really weren't that great. The materials weren't that high quality, but on the Imperial, they were pretty good. Not great in some cases, but take a look at these seats, these Barcelona-style chair-inspired seats. You can even see you got a head pillow in the back and the C-pillar there. I think that was the only domestic car that I can recall that had those during the time frame, as well as a lavalier strap to assist you in getting outside of the vehicle, and a reading light as well. The door panels are kind of a mixture of good and bad. The top portion is very padded there. You can see the casket handle door pull. You get a storage pocket beneath that with a little snap on it, so you can store items in the armrest. But they do feel a little bit cheap. They have kind of a plasticky feeling. And the instrument panel, for the most part, is lifted out of the more pedestrian Chryslers. It's very similar, as an example, to the instrument panel in my New Yorker. It does have faux wood grain on it, on the glove box as well as the dash. In some years, the Imperial would actually even have faux wood grain on the gauges themselves, which I thought was super funky, but not by 72. It does have a full complement of gauges, as you can see, including obviously the fuel gauge, the temperature gauge, ammeter, and oil pressure, which the Chryslers did not get. The one strange thing about the dash is that there's actually no turn signal indicator in the dash. There's not a turn signal indicator in the dash. You have to look out at the fender tips at the standard marker indicators that do flash when you put the turn signal on, but that's the only place where the turn signals appear. It's kind of hard to see them in the daylight. For whatever reason, they did that. On the Chryslers, you had the redundant turn signal in the dashboard, probably because on some models, the outside indicators were not standard. But on the Imperial, they were, and Chrysler cheaped out and eliminated two bulbs in the dash. I thought that was strange, but an interesting fact. Chrysler did at least give you a light to illuminate the keyhole at night, and even put a reflector underneath the top of the dashboard that would cascade some of the floodlighting onto the driver's door panel and help it illuminate at night. They did that after they eliminated the light itself that illuminated the door panel, I think in 1970 or 71, one of those 2 years. In any case, the 72 Imperial, certainly a favorite of mine and an awesome Fuselage era car. Let's move on to number 2, and that is the 1972 Plymouth Fury. We could say the Grand Fury or any one with the hidden headlights. In 1972, Plymouth would redesign its Fury, and I already mentioned the 1970 model in a previous, discussion. And the 71 was quite similar to the 70, but the grille texture was a little different. I didn't necessarily care for that. But by 72, Plymouth had introduced this interesting double loop bumper, I guess you could call it, and the hidden headlight version of the 72 Fury, to me, is just perfection. Take a look at that electric razor style, I guess, grille combined hidden headlamp area on the front end. And it's just so cool and menacing all at the same time. And then, of course, you have the Fuselage era clean body side sections. Unfortunately, this car has the body side molding, which I don't care for. So imagine this car not having it. I think it would look a little bit better. But can't really be picky. These cars are almost extinct entirely. And I also notice that area that's around the rear wheel that kind of bulges out, almost like somebody pulled it out from the body. It's especially graceful when you see it in the flesh, and I just think it gives these cars a wonderful look. Here's a little bit better photo where you can see that rear quarter panel area and that surface that I'm talking about. It kind of reminds me of some of the late 60s era Pontiacs in terms of the rear surfacing there, but again, I think just very tastefully done. This particular vehicle, by the way, I would not nominate as one of the best looking because this has the exposed headlights, and you can see that the exposed headlight treatment, it's just not the same car with it. It just looks so menacing with the hidden headlamps that, you got to get one with those if you're going to get one of these 72 Furies at all. Now, unfortunately, that hidden headlight front end that came out in 1972 would be a 1 year only Fury front end. You can see here the 1973 version, which presumably Chrysler had to go to because of those bumper standards. You notice those huge bumper guards. But the car went to exposed headlights across all models, and the front, it just looks much more conventional. So the 1972 is the one to get. The only thing I'll say about the 72 that I wish they had done a little bit more with is the rear three-quarter view and the overall tail lamp treatment. It's, again, kind of a little bit of an afterthought, it feels. Given such a strong end, the car deserves a stronger rear end, and it doesn't quite have it. But still, one of my favorite Fuselage cars of the era, but not number one, really because of that rear end. I will say that the rear did have some kind of humorous, I would suspect, tacked on bumper guards there at the very edges of the bumper that was done for light impact standards that had come into place for 1972. It looks like a total afterthought, and my guess is it probably was. Regardless, the 72 Fury is, like I said, just a 1 year only look. And the rear isn't as strong as I would have hoped, and that's why it's not number one on the list, but we will talk about number one now. And here we are at the number one position, and that is the 1969 to 1971 Chrysler 300. And I really couldn't pick a particular model year because I think the 69, 70, and 71 are all awesome, and I couldn't say whether I like the coupe or convertible the best because I also think they look great. So you just put a comment in the comment section and say which one you like the best, because I can't decide. Now, by this point, there was no more letter car 300 in the Chrysler lineup, but the 300 was still positioned as kind of a mid-range, sportier vehicle compared with the New Yorker, as an example, which was supposed to be skewed more toward luxury. And it really didn't matter which one you got. You got a nice 440 engine under hood. You could get the same engine options between, as an example, the 300 and the New Yorker. So from that perspective, they were similar, and these cars weren't necessarily as fast anymore as the original 300s were, but they still were super cool, and I love this convertible. Take a look at the styling, that full width style grille, again with the hidden headlights, accentuated by that, I guess, chrome or stainless trim that's going around the inner portion of the grille and spilling onto the headlights. It's just another cool, wide look for the car, complemented by that loop bumper. And you can contrast the front end on that 69 with the front end of the 71, which I think looks a little bit more menacing There's no longer that medallion in the middle, and that grill within a grill, almost, if you will, is now connected all the way to the middle. And I do enjoy the block Chrysler lettering on the leading edge of the hood. I just think it's a really tasteful touch. These coupes, as well as the convertibles, again, just absolutely stunning. You can see in the fender tips, there's not only a fender tip molding, but there's also lights for the turn signals that are incorporated into that molding, just so that you can see if your turn signals are working without looking down at your instrument panel. The rear three-quarter views of these 300s are also spectacular look at these quarter panels, just enormously long, huge deck lid. It almost looks cartoonish, but it still looks great. I love the block lettering 300 spelled out here on this 1969 model, as well as the near full-width taillight that is only broken in the middle by the 3 digits, 300, signifying the 300. I do think that the lower portion there, that rear bumper, looks a little bit hefty for the rear, but overall, the 300, whether it's a 69, 70, or 71, and there were a few minor differences in the tail lamp treatments as the years went on, but I think they all just look really good, and this to me is my favorite looking Fuselage era car, and how could you go wrong? Again, you got a 440 under hood. What's there to complain about? So what do you think? What's your favorite Fuselage era car? Put a comment in the comment section. Thanks again for watching. Until next time, take care.